Hi, I'm Michael, and this is mine and Sam's project, Normalized Burn Ratio, Land Cover Classification, and Change Detection, How Climate Change is Altering Wildfires in Central California. Wildfires are increasing in severity and frequency as hotter and drier summers create ideal wildfire conditions in the western United States. In the last 3 decades alone, wildfire frequency has been increasing at an exponential rate, with almost 5 times the acreage burned in 2017 than in 1984. This is in part to ongoing anthropogenic caused climate change that is altering weather patterns and creating a positive feedback loop in which every summer gets hotter and drier, and the soil loses increasing amounts of moisture, which causes an accumulation of fuel sources for fires as forests and other vegetation die off. Much of the western United States is fire adapted. The landscape co-evolved with seasonal wildfires that were frequent but low severity at a regular interval. Due to ongoing climate change and human patterns of settlement, suppression has become California's most common wildfire management policy where active fires threaten human life. As a result, much of northern and central California has had a decrease in its fire return interval, but an increase in catastrophic fires as massive amounts of dead vegetation have built up for fires to burn uncontrollably through. While wildland wildfires are usually caused by dry lightning and other summer storms, the majority of California's wildfires are often due to, in part, human action. The purpose of this study is to see if there's any noticeable change between the rim fire and the oak fire, especially in terms of climate change and fuel source, considering that there's 10 years that separate the two fires. I chose California very specifically because of the variety of biomes and the climatic changes from the north, central, and southern parts of the state that introduce a lot of the variables that factor into wildfire science, as well as the different impacts of climate change. The study area of Mariposa and Tulum counties begins in the valley and then east up into the Sierra Nevadas, and are mostly national park and forest with limited urbanization once you reach the foothills. Both counties have also been in what's classified as an extreme drought since 2007 with water restrictions. And you can see in the little box, the majority of the land class in these two areas is conifer, but also has chaparral and a little bit of grassland as well as oak woodland. And that particular note is going to be important in the land classification study. The rim fire ignited in mid-August of 2013 and very quickly spread almost 90,000 acres in 2 days. The fire engulfed much of Yosemite Valley and even burned as far east as the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. In this particular area, the primary fuel source was dense vegetation. The fire took almost 9 weeks to be fully contained, and smaller fires continued to smolder for a full year afterwards. This particular fire is called the Rim Fire because it began near the rim of the World Scenic Overlook in Stanislaus National Forest. The Oak Fire actually ignited this past summer, just 30 miles south of the Rim Fire footprint, which you can see right next to that red arrow, and then the blue box where the Oak Fire actually ignited. It was said to have extreme and unprecedented fire behavior right from the get-go. It was extremely hard to get under control because high winds blew embers for more than a mile. It was just 1/10 of the size of the Rim Fire, and its ignition began in an area with large amounts of bare ground, but because of all of the previous stated things, it was given a very high priority. The primary fuel source was stated to be tall grass, chaparral, and limited understory, just because of how many trees had died in the area due to an ongoing beetle infestation over the last couple of years. This fire and Rim Fire both had states of emergency put in place within a day or two of its ignition.
So we began by compiling the Landsat 8 and 9 images of the before and after for the two fires. Since the collection type and level were both 2, there was little or no need to do atmospheric or orthometric calibrations. We then subsetted all 4 images to focus on the burn scars themselves to be, allow for greater detail and visibility. It's less distracting by the environment. Then to begin comparing the two, the before and after images, we executed the normalized burn ratios and then found the differences of them, followed by the land cover classifications. So you'll see a little bit later on the Oak Fire has 3 less classes, and that's mainly due to the fact that there's no water or snow in this subset of the Oak Fire.
As previously stated, the purpose of the study is to see, with a decade between the two fires, if there's any difference in severity or any kind of trend in which land class changed the most. This is also in regard to climate change as well as any kind of changes that occurred in the land classes because of human settlement. As seen in the figures, the rim fire is much larger than the oak fire, almost 10 times its size, but in terms of relative severity, the oak fire was more severe. Inside the fire footprint of the rim fire, the largest class was unburned at almost 30%, while the oak fire's unburned percentage was only 6%. The largest class for the oak fire was moderate low severity at 33%, and then low and high severity followed up very closely behind. The largest class for the rim fire was a tie between low and high severity, both at 20%. Overall, the oak fire was much more contained than the rim fire, but considering that the primary ignition source for the oak fire was bare ground rather than dense vegetation like the rim fire, its severity and spread was unprecedented. The rim fire was still a very dramatic fire in its spread. The Landsat image used for the study area was actually taken just 2 days before the fire ignition, so you really get a good idea of how much the land changed. Standalone National Forest is mostly dense vegetation with snowpack in the high Sierras, as seen in the right corner, and the rim fire burned through almost 200,000 acres. Bare ground land class more than doubled in percentage, while both dense and spare vegetation decreased significantly by the fire's containment.
So here I was actually pretty surprised when I found these numbers, because I was thinking it was going to be a little more drastic than it was. The dense vegetation overall went down less than 1%, which I guess makes sense because there was time for the surrounding area to grow back. Sparse vegetation, same thing, only down about 2%. But the barren land makes sense going up since, there was a literal burn scar in the earth. But it was a fairly small fire, and it was contained fairly quickly. So I guess that accounts for, the minimal change in land cover here. So this is where we see better that the oak fire has 2 less classes, just due to the fact that there was no water or snow in the subset. You can see in the oak fire, dense vegetation had about a 1.5% decrease, sparse vegetation about 6% decrease, and then barren was up about 5%. For the rim fire, we see a 80% decrease in snow, about a 57% decrease in dense vegetation, a whopping 500% increase in barren land, and then the sparse vegetation actually went up, which again I guess makes sense. It had time to grow back in the surrounding areas, and then water was down 13%.
Both fires were unprecedented in their own right. The rim fire had been one of the largest California had experienced when it burned, and the oak fire's ignition in shrubland and its aggressive spread through predominantly bare ground with severity was a record of its own. The amount of fuel source for the oak fire, counted as dense and sparse vegetation, at its ignition was still less than the amount of the same land class after the rim fire was contained. Decades-long water restrictions made firefighting efforts just as difficult and precarious, even though it was still just a tenth of the size.
Yeah, so that's about all we have. These 2 fires are pretty different when compared to each other, but not atypical for the area that they're in. The Sierra Nevadas are pretty low moisture. There's not a lot of water regardless, and the terrain predetermines kind of these burn patterns for the most part. But it really just goes to show the effects that humans are having on the environment, and then in turn how these fires are affecting humans. I mean, there were multiple fatalities between the 2 of them, and we aren't making it any better either, so it's really important to pay attention to these kinds of things.